This presentation gives an overview of the fourth greenhouse gas study prepared for the IMO and to be presented to the MEPC later in 2020. The presentation is given by Dr. Tristan Smith from the University College London.
Hi everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of this work with you. I've got a set of slides here which I'll circulate so you can look at them more slowly, but I'll use them as a frame to just bring out what we think are the key messages from the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study for a global audience, and I'll try and add as much as I can about the Pacific specifics as I go through them. That's a bit of preamble that you don't need to worry about, but this is a quick set of logos of all the organisations that were involved. The consortium that did the work was 9 different organisations from 4 different continents and 6 countries, and had a reasonable representation therefore, but obviously, sadly, still doesn't have any representation from the Pacific and Africa for that matter as well, which is pretty terrible. And hopefully this will be the last one that doesn't have that representation. The next set of slides are basically just running through what we think are the answers to these questions. These we've referred to as frequently asked questions, so high-level things that a journalist or maybe a government representative might be interested in understanding. And this is the complete list, but I'll move very rapidly on to the first question, which is a pretty basic one about what's happening to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the set of data here. Both total and international shipping emissions rose. Total emissions rose by about 10% over the period 2012 to 2018, which is the period of the study. International shipping emissions rose slightly less, and by about 6% during the period of the study. The general trend has been that we've had a consistent rise over that time period. None of that is at all reassuring from the perspective of trying to do our best to get to a 1.5 degree target. It's completely a trend that is going in completely the wrong direction. One of the things that we've focused on advancing in this particular study was who owns these different emissions and how do we do the accountancy. And so this is a bit of an explanation on this slide about one of the major advances that we were able to do because the data has now got so detailed globally, and our methods, our algorithms for processing that data have got more and more advanced over the last few years. So now we are able to look at any ship that has an AIS transponder. We're able to look at it on an hourly basis, but also identify the country at which port calls occur. One of the problems that we have is that in the Pacific and in many other countries, a lot of important shipping is not transmitting on AIS. And so this isn't a perfect way of tracking shipping, which is in SIDS and LDCs. We don't at this point really know exactly what we're not able to see with this type of method, but it is effective for the shipping, which is the dominant source of international shipping CO2. So I would say that using this method, we can be confident about international shipping emissions. We don't necessarily have confidence in the estimates produced of the domestic shipping emissions. The first step that we had to make was to get a system, a method, which was really reliable for isolating voyages that occurred between 2 international ports, and that's what has been advanced here. The main takeaway from that method is that actually a lot more emissions fall within national jurisdictions than had previously been thought. In this study, we estimate 30% of total shipping emissions are actually domestic responsibility. They should be handled in NDCs. They come under a country's obligations to the UNFCCC through the Paris Climate Agreement. The other 70% fall within the IMO's expected remits, but people will argue and continue to argue about exactly whether an emission is the IMO's or somebody else. But broadly under the IMO negotiations, the 70% are the responsibility of that organisation, that UN agency. That's what we would normally expect to regulate at the IMO, but IMO regulation can influence the behaviour of domestic fleets as well. So part of this is the accountancy, what is within the IMO's accountancy, and what the other part of it is what is in incentivisation. And incentivisation by IMO could be for all types of ships, but the accountancy is limited to international shipping only. One of the things that we think some people will point out is that we still have emissions which are lower than 2008. And so people will say, well, emissions are still below their peak in 2008. You know, we're on the right trajectory. That isn't reassuring to us because 2008 was an extraordinary year. It was a year around the financial crisis, just before it, when there were very high levels of activity, higher speeds by a long way, much higher CO2 emissions. So it's not really a fair comparison. And it doesn't really matter that emissions are only now at sort of levels similar to 2008. What matters is whether we're on a trajectory to halve emissions by 2030, and the projections that you get from the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study are for significant increases in emissions over the next 3 decades, or at best holding them approximately at their current level, neither of which are obviously compatible with 1.5 degrees that needs emissions to go to zero within that same time frame, and preferably sooner than 2050. There are a few things which are particularly important for the IMO negotiations, in particular the short-term measures debate that's ongoing. One of them is what has happened to the trend in carbon intensity since 2008. And that's important because in the initial strategy, one of the ambitions is stated as reduction of carbon intensity by at least 40%. One of the methods to calculate carbon intensity trends gives us a 30% improvement. So in other words, we've already done 75% by that metric of the 40% target, which was set for 2030. And that just illustrates how weak the ambition was in the initial strategy that we unfortunately all agreed to. Those who were in the initial strategy negotiations may remember that all the political capital and all the effort was deployed really on the 2050 number, setting that number to be as high as possible, and the at least 50% is still not high enough for 1.5 degrees. It's not high enough for well below 2. But it was a very important point to establish that basically we had to shift off fossil fuels. But unfortunately, because the political capital was spent there, no one paid attention, or no one, the chair in particular, didn't open up the debate on the 2030 carbon intensity. So we ended up with a proposal. I can't remember which member state made it. It might have been Japan. But it's a low ambition proposal to just have to do 40% by 2030, clearly illustrated here, given that we're saying that it's about 30%. There is a metric that will give you a 20% number of improvement. That's AER. There's no good explanation as to why that's significantly lower than the 30% improvement that comes from this other metric. But we can expect, because there are two numbers and they're different, the different sides to use them as pawns in their argument, and we need to be prepared for that, and not just sort of lump on one or the other for its convenience. The report has a number of pieces of ammunition which I think are important for the ongoing debate about short-term measures, which I know is not necessarily viewed as the solution to decarbonising shipping by all, but I think is an important opportunity to maximise what we achieve this decade, and also because operational goal-based policy is an option for deeper decarbonisation if we need it as a fallback. It's a very useful insurance policy, literally insurance policy to have, because it could drive us to zero if we needed it to. So there's some good evidence in the report from our perspective for why operational goal-based is so important. It's mainly because all of the carbon intensity savings that we've seen for the last decade have come from operational behaviour and not from technology. The technical change in the fleet is very small, and that is also evidenced in the report. We always talk about CO2 because that's the dominant emission, but again, an addition and advance in this report is the fact that we also have black carbon accounted for, and that's a very significant emission. It's not that important in the Pacific because black carbon is particularly dangerous in the Arctic, where if it's emitted, it can come down, land on the ice and cause albedo effects. So it's shipping in the vicinity of large masses of ice which I don't believe is a major circumstance in the Pacific at the moment, but who knows with climate change. And then methane is another problem emission, hasn't been given enough attention, and it rose by approximately 150% because lots of people have used cheap engines with high methane slip in the last few years that have increased the amount of methane being emitted into the atmosphere. The fuel mix and different ship types are listed on these graphs here. The breakdown is between heavy fuel oil, a quantity of LNG, liquid natural gas, which is used predominantly in liquid natural gas carriers. And then you can see some interesting splits between HFO and MDO. I don't think that's particularly remarkable or relevant to your debates, where I guess the majority of your shipping is using MDO at the moment or equivalent. And then finally, a comment about the relevance of this to the Poseidon Principles clients, or the clients of banks who are using the Poseidon Principles. I don't think this is particularly important here, but it is something that we're now doing, is applying this methodology, which is not an IMO regulation, but a means to assess a fleet's carbon intensity. We're applying that methodology to fleets of different registries and assessing whether or not they have embedded a significant level of climate risk. So there might be more on this subject later. And finally, there's a point or a set of points here, which is about the quality of the data that we're using, whether it's reliable, whether it will be superseded by IMO data collection system. This is very important because many of the member states and the industry associations at the last negotiations at the IMO were saying, basically, we don't have enough data, we have to wait. We have to wait another 3 years before we can make any decisions. What we're trying to do here is say, you have all the data you need, it's good quality, and it's actually probably going to be better than the data we'll have in 2 or 3 years' time. So stop using that as an excuse to delay adoption of policy. Thank you very much. I hope the rest of your discussions go well, and I would love to clarify anything if I can. I think Ali and Pete can help you with my contact details if you don't already have them. Thank you. Bye.